Hello, trumpet players. In this video, I want to introduce to you my concept, my philosophy that I call the art of accumulative practice. My teaching, my trumpet teaching, exists in layers of philosophies. In that regard, I'm probably more of a philosopher than I am a trumpet teacher. Really. So, you guys already know about, if you've seen all my videos, maybe all of you haven't done that, but you already know that I have a bottom level foundational philosophy that I call the wholesome musical priorities. And then I have a variety of other layers up over that one. Uh, Performance layers, practice layers, organizational layers, all these different philosophies that go over the top of the bottom philosophy of wholesome musical priorities. But there's one that I haven't talked about as much because it's the newest one, but it's foundational more. So that bottom layer, the musical priorities, is almost not music, right? That one's important because it helps us find direction in our music. And without direction, the music isn't as good. Without a voice, the music is not as good. Without a message, the music is not as good. That's why I teach that stuff. You guys know that I draw the line. I will not just use trumpet as an opportunity to preach, right? That's not how I operate. It might look like that on the surface. That's not how it is. The reason I teach the priorities is because it makes you a better player. But above, the next level, over the priorities, is this art of accumulative practice. And that's a hard word for me to say. Accumulative. Oof. Yeah. Accumulative practice, okay? And what is accumulative practice? Before we go on with my story and how I got here, let's talk about what it is. Well, more accurately, let's talk about what it's not. The accumulative practice is the opposite of maintenative practice or maintenance practice, right? Most of the music world believes in maintenance practice, and basically that philosophy is, if I don't practice at least this much, my music will suffer, and if my music suffers, then I suffer. Right? That's the philosophy that's taught. I don't teach that philosophy. I teach that every minute you spend practicing, or for that matter, every minute you spend doing something that's going to enrich your music counts. Every minute that you spend practicing makes you another minute better than you were before you practice. There's no, your music has to suffer. There is none of that. And yes, part of what I'm teaching here has psychological effects on you, right? And I actually believe that this is the more wholesome, natural way to approach music, and that the other way, where you can expect when you practice less to sound bad, that's the psychologically messed up approach. And yes, I am suggesting that most people, when it comes to music, have their wires crossed in the way that they practice and the way they approach practicing. And this is why I teach the way I do. If all you have is 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes to practice today, that 5 minutes counts. That 2 minutes counts. 1 minute, 30 seconds. That's 30 seconds better than you were if you didn't do the 30 seconds. Okay, so that's the bare bones of what the accumulative philosophy is that every bit of practice that you do counts. Now, this is not necessarily true for everybody. Why is that? Because some people practice terribly, right? Some people just don't know how to practice. This only works. This philosophy only works if you know how to practice. And I don't mean if you know my way to practice. No, there are other practice techniques that work besides what I teach. I think I have a pretty broad, I think I cover most bases. But I'm not going to be arrogant enough to say that I know every way to practice. I think that would be ridiculous. Anyone who says stuff like that has no humility whatsoever. And I don't want to be like that. So I'm not going to say that you have to practice my way. But the way you practice let me put it this way. One of the key components of accumulative practice is you don't forget stuff, right? You don't forget how to play the trumpet. You don't forget how the song goes. When you practice properly, you don't forget, okay? And so if you've been practicing and you forget, then there's something wrong with the way you're practicing. Okay, so that's one of the key components really to the accumulative approach is that you got to learn how to practice correctly. You have to learn how to practice correctly. Otherwise, if you don't learn how to practice correctly, then you have to go with that other traditional maintenative. I keep using the word maintenative. It's not a word, but I've been using it for so long, it's a word to me. That traditional maintenative approach that says if you don't practice at least this much every day, then your playing will suffer. That's going to be true for you if you don't practice correctly. Of course it's going to be true for you because the only thing you have is your time on the horn. That's all you've got. So yes, now what I want to do with this video is give you a little bit of a background story about how I got here. This is one of the most, I want to use the word mature, but not in the sense that saying like I'm such a mature person. No, the philosophy itself is a more mature philosophy, and what that means is other philosophies had to be in place first. I guess another word for it would be complex. But the philosophy itself is not complex. So that's why I use the word uh, mature. Because certain things had to happen in certain orders for me to get where I am now. Okay? And I think if we want to trace this all the way back to the beginning, I think this really all started with my invention of the tonalization studies. And I'm going to remind you guys, I've said it in maybe a couple of videos, the inspiration for the tonalization studies comes from Charlie Parker, of all places, right? Places, not of all people, to inspire this. I had the epiphany that led to the tonalization studies when I was reading an album cover, and the album cover said that Charlie Parker, some dude was hanging out outside of his practice room. I think it was an album cover. That was 35, almost 40 years ago now. But the way I remember it is I was reading an album cover while I was, at the music library, sitting down there in the little cubicles with my headphones on, listening to an LP. And I'm reading the liner notes and all that stuff. And it said that this dude was sitting outside Charlie Parker's practice room and they heard him practice for 8 hours and he was in one key for the whole 8 hours. Reading that was what led me to invent my tonalization studies. And when you look at my tonalization studies, you'll say, well, those exercises aren't original. You would be correct. Those exercises are not original. There's some original tweaks about the exercises, but the exercises themselves are not original. It's what you do with the exercises that makes it tonalization studies. Okay, it's what you do with them. That's what the concept is, not the scales themselves, not the patterns themselves. But the way that the tonalization studies became the first seed in the accumulative philosophy was because you're supposed to do them only in one key at a time. So if you're doing them in one key at a time, you have to be organized about the way you do them, or you're going to favor one key over another key. And you're going to have keys that you don't favor, that are going to be weak keys for you. And I recognized this early on, right? So I decided I would be organized about the order that I practiced them in so that I would hit every scale equally. And by doing that, I created in my own practice time sort of what's that called in baseball when you can ambidextrous. If you can hit from both sides, right? Um, I'm sort of ambidextrous for all the keys because of the way I've been practicing. I have the same dexterity. I think that's what ambidextrous, the root word for ambidextrous, right, is dexterity. I've got the same dexterity in every key. And so now let's fast forward. So that was mid 80s. Let's fast forward now to early to mid 90s, about 10 years later, maybe. Maybe not quite 10 years, maybe more like 7. And I had just, I'm going to say, got out of school. I'm technically a dropout, but let's not talk about that. Right? I'm educated. I'm very educated. I just don't have any degrees. And I'm sure there's a lot of musicians just like me. So I'm not ashamed of anything. I have a wonderful education, and that's what I went to school for, and I'm happy with that. Okay? So, but when I finally got out of school, out of college, I had all this time now, and I said to myself, I'm going to make use of this time. I'm going to finally now, for the first time in my life, practice as much as I'm supposed to practice. And at the time, I was still living in that world that said you have to do everything that needs to be done on a daily basis. And here I am. At this point, I started practicing as much as 8 hours a day. On my slower days, I would practice more like between 2 and 4 hours a day. It was rare for me to do actually 2 hours. Normally 4 hours a day, up to as much as 8 hours a day of practice. And that went on for over 20 years. But at the beginning of that, I thought, oh, this is great. With all this time I'm spending on the horn, finally, I'll have the time to get everything done every day. Guess what? Even with 8 hours in one day, you don't have time to get everything done. And that was very frustrating. I can't tell you how frustrating it was. So I started the whole think outside the box thing. And and I might have said this on some other videos, but it's part of this philosophy, right? Um, I decided that my practice day needed more time. And my think outside the box solution was to make my practice day more than 24 hours. At first, I made it 36 hours long. And that happened, I did that for I think about 3 days. My practice day was was over at about noon the second day, and then I would warm up again after noon and get that head start on the next day's practice, right? So I would, in other words, another way to say this is I was started spreading 2 days of practice over a 3-day period. But in my mind, the way I was seeing it is my practice day was now 36 hours long. And it didn't take long for me to realize that that wasn't good enough. So I said, since I'm outside the box already, let's make my practice day 48 hours long. And I actually did that for a little while. Guess what? That still was not enough to cover every base. All the stuff, and maybe it was because I'm a classical player and a jazz player. Maybe that was complicating things a little bit. I don't think so. I think there's so much stuff that we need to cover as musicians that you can't cover all of it. So this is the next thing that started leading me towards a more accumulative approach, is because I understood now that you just even with a full-time professional trumpet player like I was at that time, still today by the way, it's just I do more um I don't do as much practice today as I did 25 years ago. Um, oh wait, that's not 25 years, that's more like 30 years. Um, and I'm not ashamed of that. You know, they talk about that 10,000 hour rule. I've way past 10,000 hours. Um, and you know, if I want to practice more, it's there. And that's part of the accumulative thing. We'll get back to that. Um, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So yes, in the mid 90s, I started practicing in a way that really what this forces you to do, if you really want to cover every base, and really you should, by the way, you shouldn't have weaknesses. Not 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 because of your negligence. I mean, we all have weaknesses like like physical weaknesses or personality weaknesses, but you shouldn't have weaknesses because you just couldn't bother to get around to doing what you should have done. We don't need those kind of weaknesses over the top of all of our other weaknesses, right? You know, see what I'm saying? And that's what this experiment did for me, is it made me realize that practicing everything that needed to be practiced required me to be organized. So I started getting organized with my practice in the yeah, I think let's say mid 90s, okay? And just to give you an example of how organized I was, another local professional trumpet player came to me and she said, Eddie, I want to take a lesson with you. I'm like, okay, you know, that's not, when someone's a great player, you know, the pros that come to me, it's not that I don't teach pros, everyone's welcome. The pros that come to me are usually in bad shape, right? They're having trouble. They've got chop problems. They've got whatever it is. Something's wrong and they need my help. And that's why, by the way, I have a video about this. That's why I don't go around telling people that so-and-so studied with me. And because I don't do that, maybe you don't believe me. I don't care. That's not what this is about. I don't go around telling people that so-and-so studied with me or that some famous guy uses my books or anything like that. I don't normally do that. Okay, but that's a side tangent. Um, so this professional trumpet player comes to me and she says, I want to take lessons with you. I heard that you're the most organized practicer in the world, or something along those lines. And I'm like, okay, come on over, I'll show you what I do. And at back in those days, I had several notebooks, right? I had, and the one notebook was like the ring from the Lord of the Rings, right? The one ring that controls the other rings. So that was like the master notebook, and that so I get to that notebook in certain places in the notebook, and it tells me to go to this notebook where I do certain things, and then that notebook where I do certain things, and I think I had 4 notebooks total. I showed her the whole spiel. Um, I have since then simplified it a little bit, but it's in the simplification, it's actually more organized now, but less clumsy. But I get more organized as I go, not less organized. So yes, that's how organized I am with my practice, that the other pros in town regard me as the most organized practicer, right? Actually, if I need to be remembered about something, I'm okay with that. If they don't remember anything else about me, but they said, oh, that Eddie Lewis guy, yeah, he was a real organized practicer. Yeah, I'm okay with that, really. Um, so yes, that's what happened in the 90s is I decided I needed to be more organized. And then in 2004, my ex left me. And I had trouble practicing after that. So I went from one extreme to the other. I went from this extreme where I was um, practicing so much to practicing almost not at all. And you have to understand what I mean by practice. So once you become organized as a practicer, you get to understand, at least for me, this is how it worked, right? If it wasn't written down, it didn't count. Okay? So if I played my tonalization studies in the key of F sharp, but I didn't write it down, it didn't count. Okay, and I lived that way for a long, long time. So for 3 years, I went without really writing any of it down. You can see my logs from that time period, and um, like I think I logged stuff once every 4 or 5 weeks. That's one genuine practice session every 4 or 5 weeks, and this went on for 3 years. There would be like spurts. Like maybe there was a 2 week spurt where I practiced every day. But then I'd go another several months without practicing at all. Now, did that mean I didn't have any time on the horn? No, that's not what it means. I was actually at the height of my playing as a local sideman. I had during that time as many as 12 gigs a day, not a day, 12 gigs a week. As many as, I'm not saying that was every week. I would say that the least number of gigs I had during that time was 5 gigs a week. So some people would say, well, then you didn't really need to practice. You were playing so much. Um, yeah, that's not how it works, really. That's not how it works. If all you're practicing for is to be ready for the gig, like for this gig that you have today, that's just warming up. And yes, I did some warm-ups. That's not practicing. Practicing makes you a better trumpet player. And I wasn't practicing during that time. One of the beautiful things that happened when I came out of that is I just picked up where I left off. That's that's the beautiful thing about practicing that way, right? It's all written down. You don't have to think, well, what was I practicing the last time I practiced? I know it was 3 years ago, but what was it? Yeah, most people can't remember what they practiced 2 weeks ago. And if you're telling me you can't remember, then you're lying or you're not practicing enough. Right? Okay? Most normal people can't remember. And the reason why, by the way, the reason why we can't remember is because it's when you practice properly, it's so monotonous. And in fact, when you practice properly, the whole point of practicing properly is to put that information in your subconscious mind. What happens when you're successful with that? You start daydreaming. You start daydreaming while you're practicing, and I know that there's a lot of people that say, oh, that's the worst thing that can happen. I think it's the best thing that can happen in most cases. There are some scenarios, like if you're learning a new piece or something, you don't want to actually be daydreaming because then you could learn it wrong. But for most things that we do on the trumpet, even learning a new piece, if you're doing, like, for example, each section 10 times, you start daydreaming after the third or fourth time. That's normal. You daydream because the music has now become automatic so that you don't have to think about it. Well, while you're sitting there doing something, you don't have to think about it. Your mind is still active. So you start thinking, what would I want for lunch today? Stuff like that, you know? Um, or thinking about politics or thinking about whatever it is that you daydream about, right? It happens when you're practicing properly. That's the kind of practice we were talking earlier. That's the kind of practice when that creates learning that you don't forget. Okay, so that's what happened. Is it was a beautiful thing when I started practicing again. I just simply picked up where I left off. Do you know what that represents? I joke a lot, right, about the trumpet god. Being organized like that removes the shackles of having to be dedicated to the trumpet god. You know, you are no longer shackled to that instrument. That instrument no longer rules your life. By being organized and practicing in a way that you don't forget, the time that you spend off is not a loss. And you just, when you come back, you just pick up where you left off. It's an amazing thing. It's a liberating thing. There's this accumulative approach to practicing is probably the most liberating thing I've ever done in my own personal life in relationship to music. It's the most liberating thing I teach my students. I have students that come in here, they're shackled to the instrument. And the instrument determines for them, like a god, right? Just like a god, the instrument determines for them when they're going to be happy and when they're going to be sad, when they're going to be successful and when they're going to fail. This philosophy, the art of accumulative practice, breaks those shackles. You're now free. I look serious, right? It is serious. It is serious. There's a lot of people that need to be freed like that, liberated. A lot of people need to be liberated from this beast that we worship every day, this false idol that we worship. People need to be liberated from that. Okay, so that takes us up to about 2006. Then I started teaching again. Oh, I didn't mention that. I quit teaching private lessons. I was real weird how that worked out, because I was teaching a lot of other stuff when I wasn't teaching private lessons. When I decided to teach private lessons again, I'm excited about all this stuff, and now the accumulative approach didn't exist yet as a philosophy. Those things that I've shared with you so far are just the things that led up to it. Then what happened? I formalized my method for learning music. I tweaked a lot of the stuff in the physical approach that I teach. So this interaction that I have with the students, and also this other stuff came up. So basically, those things that I told you that led up to this set the foundation, set the framework for this new philosophy. And, I'm not going to go into the details of the philosophy. This is just an introduction, and I probably won't go into the details because this really needs to be a book, and I don't want to talk about the details until the book is out. However, that said, if you sign up for lessons with me, you're going to get this philosophy, because this is all I teach. I can't teach anymore. Now I tell you in other videos that I can teach other methods, but when I say that, I'm talking about physical stuff. I'm talking about embouchure stuff. I can teach someone that's got a very different embouchure from what will work with my method. But this accumulative thing, I can't teach someone to go now and be a slave to the trumpet god. I will not do that. I cannot, with a clean conscience, teach like that. So if you want to learn more about the accumulative approach and be liberated from this monster that we've been shackled to all those years, then we will learn that stuff in the lessons. That's all I teach. We'll do the tonalization studies. We'll do the routine. We'll do the learning how to practice music properly. That's what I do in the lessons, right? But all of that, the framework that's all on, is the accumulative approach. All right. So if you have any questions about this, please feel free to ask. I think the questions actually help me solidify the philosophy. If I don't have people to bounce the ideas off, and I have that with the students, but the more the merrier, right? The more people we can bounce this idea off of, the better. Okay, so please feel free, and comments too, right? If you think I'm just a nutcase, say that I'm just a nutcase, right? If you believe that I'm wrong, that the way people practice traditionally, if you think that it's true that if you don't practice enough, your music should suffer, tell me this. Tell me why you think this, okay? I read all the comments, and I usually respond to everything. Sometimes maybe something slips through the cracks, but I usually do respond, okay? So I welcome all of your comments, all of your questions, okay? Other than that, God bless you, and we will see you on the next video. Thank you for watching this video. I wanted to spend just a minute to let you know that there's a better, more convenient, more organized way to access all of these videos. We have literally hundreds of videos here on YouTube, and quite frankly, it's a bit of a mess. So, to make it a little bit more organized and easier for you to access what you want to access, I created a separate page, a separate area on my website. That's eddielewis.com. And if you go to eddielewis.com, click on the menu, click on videos. It will take you there. I have the videos categorized, and then within those categories, some of them, like the educational videos, you can click on it and go in there and look for the videos specifically that you're looking for. Okay? So go to eddielewis.com, EDDIELEWIS.com. Thank you very much.